Hi, welcome everybody, and welcome to one of our webinars. And so this one is far more about the Sustainable Development Goals and innovation. And we are going to have a great chat today. You've got myself, Heather Campbell, CEO of Bush Heritage. We've got Garry McDonald, who'll be sharing his story from the work that he's doing up at Nadu Hills, climate ready work. And we'll also have Linda Bradburn, who'll be sharing with us some of her stories. I'd like to now start, I suppose, more into the the sort of more formal part of our presentation and just share a few thoughts. But as I do that, I'd like to start by paying my respects to the traditional owners of the land on which we're working and living on at the moment. And for me, that's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And in the case of the work that Garry will be sharing, I pay our respects to Dja Dja Wurrung and the partnership that we have with them, and pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I'd like to start off by just sharing a little slide. We'll see if it works. Here we go. And this is actually not a picture of Bush Heritage Reserve. This is actually my backyard. So I'm lucky enough to live in the hills on the edge of the Yarra Valley. And I've been spending a lot of time walking around the property recently and noticed that I'm losing far more trees than I thought I ever would see. So when I'm out there, I'm looking at the trees and I'm thinking, I always thought the trees would always be there and the rivers and the sky would always be there. But I'm starting to question that, and I'm starting to wonder, what is it that is actually killing the trees? Is it climate? Is it climate change that's actually allowed the termites on the property to go absolutely berserk? But what's actually happening there? Why are we actually losing some of those trees on the north facing slope? I think that's something that all of us are contemplating, and that's why it's one of those important things that grounds me every day and what we do, and the importance of what Bush Heritage does, and the importance of the work that Garry will share with what he's doing at Nadu Hills, and trying to work out how do we actually combat some of the challenges that we're facing. When I talked about that too, looking at what's in my backyard, this is what grounds everybody in Bush Heritage. This is actually a photo of Bulkamata in South Australia, and this is pre the drought, so it's actually looking in pretty good condition here. And so our vision at Bush Heritage is healthy country protected forever. And so that means we are basically there as stewards for the land, making sure that we manage the feral animals, the pests, and that we're trying to actually tip the balance in favour of native species. So our purpose really is to bring the bush back to good health, and that's what actually motivates us all the time and helps drive the work that we do, whether that be across the 37 reserves that we're lucky enough to own and manage, or the 14 partnerships that we have with Aboriginal partners, and particularly those where we're working on their land and we're working with them and learning a lot from them. And there's also partnerships with local landholders, our neighbours, people that are trying to protect areas on their properties for conservation. So we operate across the whole of Australia. And when we look at this, we're working on Australia, but we're part of a far bigger global focus, and not just on conservation, but on how we actually make this a great planet to continue living on. And I think as we've spent more time in our homes recently, I certainly know that I've contemplated more about where are we actually at as a human race, and how do we actually bring equity? How do we actually make sure that we're fighting extinction? And that really links our work into the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And so these are 17 areas of focus or goals that were set back in 2015. And a lot of them had target dates of 2020 or 2030. And a number of these were focused on looking at like number 15, life on the land, making sure that we're actually protecting the land, that we're protecting species, that we're trying to end extinction, that we're actually looking after our land. And the climate action one was really focusing on reducing our climate impact, but also looking at how we can build a more resilient both society but also the planet on which we live. So these goals we very much link into. We actually work across 8 of them, but the key ones that we focus on are 13, 14, 15, and 17. Because what I think all of us recognise is we can't do any of this without doing it in partnership, which is why it's really important that we're actually connecting in with all of you. And I should have said earlier, I wanted to, welcome all of you personally, but when I looked at the list, I'm going, oh, if I read out everybody's name, that'll be the end of our time. But I would like to welcome all of you to this call. And I know there's some Heathers, there's some Helens, there's some Johns, there's some Chris's, there's Kates, there's Alisons, there's Anns, and there's many others. So please, welcome to this talk and that connection with how we all work together in partnership, because without all of you and the work that we do with our neighbours, with research organisations and everybody on this planet, we can't actually achieve these goals that were set at the United Nations. And for me, it's not just about goals that are set at a global level, but it's about that very personal link of wanting my kids to be able to see the species that I grew up, wanting, if they ever have their kids, so wanting those grandkids to be able to see that too, and to have that link with what's important on our planet, and to see the joy that you get from interacting with nature, and recognizing that it provides so much more for us in the way of, pollinators and productions, and we need it to sustain life. But it's also about sustaining our souls, particularly when we're faced with some major threats. So one of the key threats that we've had, of course, over the summer has been the change in climate, and then seeing that manifest in the really severe fires that we had through what's been called the Black Summer. We had fires across 7 of our reserves, but 4 of them were significantly impacted. And these ones are in New South Wales predominantly, so Bradburn, an hour east of Canberra, Scottsdale, about an hour south of Canberra, Yantabulla Swamp, which is owned by South Endeavour Trust, but we manage it in conjunction with Naree, and that's west of Burke, and then also the Yorker Reserve, which is west of Cairns. And there were significant fires on these reserves, from Bradburn, which the whole reserve was burnt, through to Yorker, with about 40% of it burnt in a hot fire through the summer period. And our teams did a fantastic job with the neighbours fighting those fires, whether it be Yorker on Christmas Day, and that's when the team were out fighting that fire, or Scottsdale, which was the last of the major fires, which came through from Canberra, across the hills, over the Murrumbidgee, and into the reserve, and impacted a lot of the work that had been done there. And you look at these photos and you can get a sense of despair, but there is hope. So I was at Bradburn, it would be probably about 6 weeks after that fire, and I started to see the epicormic growth. I started to see the ferns come back. I could hear the frogs. I saw 2 lyrebirds. I saw wombat scat. The neighbours had seen some greater gliders come back, and we started to do some supplementary feeding for them. And this is just a quote from our senior ecologist about what he's seeing, and with the fact that we've got that sense of hope. At Scottsdale, where a whole lot of the area had been burnt, and particularly the weeds, the love grass had been burnt, what happened then was all the native grasses and herbs really sprung up, and we had a fantastic seed set and flowering season this year. So the team's been out collecting those seeds so that we can start to grow up some of the plants, propagate them, and plant them back out. So there is hope, and that's the thing that keeps us going at Bush Heritage. There is always hope, even faced with the challenges that we have. So that's some of the challenges, and there's even broader hope that we've got. And that's where, the work of Garry and the stories of people like Linda are really important. So we'll hear from Linda a bit later, and Linda's fantastic. She's one of our supporters and comes in and volunteers with us, and has had, 10 years of heading up environment at the Austin and Repat Hospital before then with Melton City Council. So comes with a great level of skill, but a passion for the work that we do. And Garry, who you can see standing here and who will connect in with us with his presentation shortly, is focused across our Karakara Wedderburn landscape. So that's an area, if you think about it, out towards St Arnaud. It's sort of rolling hills, it's boxy grass woodlands, but it's very, very fragmented. There's a mixture of public parks and state parks, of privately owned and protected areas, of covenanted areas. There's lots of smaller sheep farms in there, and it's about connecting up a corridor with our neighbours, with other organisations like Trust for Nature and the parks organisations. And what is fantastic is Garry is able to bring to it his skills. So he's, you may have heard that Garry is an entomologist, but I know that he and I have had conversations where we've talked about the fact of how great it is to be involved on a project that's not focused on bugs. That's actually focused on developing a really rigorous scientific process to look at how do we actually reverse what we're seeing happening up at Nadu Hills, which is up the top towards Wedderburn, so at the top area of the map, because we're losing our large trees. How do we look at building in that climate resilience? So Garry is able to bring his years of being a scientist, his work at the University of Melbourne, his previous work where he had 22 years at the Victorian Department of Agriculture, and actually bring that and that rigour to a project for us so that we can really look at determining how do we actually build in that long-term resilience from a climate perspective. That is fantastic. So I'll now hand over to you. So I will now mute, and Garry, it's over to you.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you very much. Look, it's a great thrill for me to talk to you all about this project that I've come to really feel passionate about. It's an exciting project, and one that I hope you'll agree with me will leave an enduring legacy well beyond my years, that will help to inform both both bush heritage, but also the local community. The team that I've been working with on this project, you've already heard of Matt Appleby, our senior ecologist, Julie Radford's ecologist up in the north of the state, and Hayley Simon, a volunteer who works with me. And then Michael Coleman is a partner also. He's a senior manager from Greenfleet, who are partners in this project. So it's great to work in this terrific team. So there's 4 key points that I'd like you to take with you, if nothing else, from this presentation. First of all, we've observed quite significant climate-induced dieback of some important key eucalypt species at Nadu Hills. I'll talk about Nadu in a moment. Our aim in this project is to maintain the ecosystem function of this reserve in the face of climate change. Our strategy, we've used climate-adjusted provincing, which is very jargon-based, I know, but I'll talk about that a bit more in there as a revegetation strategy. And the culmination of the thinking and the planning has gone into a large field experiment that went in late last year that will allow us over decades to track the genetic changes of the provenances and families of trees that we've introduced. And as Heather says, this work certainly supports the Sustainable Development Goals 13 and 15. 13 is about taking urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts, and 15 to protect, restore and promote sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems. So I hope you'll agree with me, by the end of this presentation, you'll see that we're actively supporting both those development goals. So Nadu Hills, I'm sure a lot of you have been there or certainly know of Nadu Hills. Heather's just described it, sits right up the top northern corner of the Karakara landscape. It's just northwest of Wedderburn. Here's another map, Melbourne, Bendigo, Wedderburn here. And it's a reserve of about 1,200 hectares. It consists of 3 protected ecological vegetation communities, or EVCs, as many of you would know them. The predominant one is grassy woodlands, which is classified as endangered, but there's also box ironbark forest and mallee. So that's Nadu Hills Reserve. So the dieback. So over the last 10 or 12 years, we've been witnessing serious dieback on the reserve and outside the reserve across the surrounding landscape. It's affected many old growth and young trees at Nadu, predominantly grey box, to some extent yellow box, to a large extent yellow box, and also other species, but we're really focusing on grey box and yellow box because they form such an important structural component of the Nadu Hills Reserve. What we've seen is significant canopy loss. The whole tree canopies died, and as a result, in many cases, but not all, some level of epicormic growth, which invariably burns off, and coppicing. You can see here an example of coppicing where some of those trees are actually still looking okay after many years of growth, but there's never quite the same. And the shocking thing about this is through this loss, we've lost almost all the mature trees, grey box trees predominantly, have gone complete with their hollows, so which are it's a devastating loss of habitat for so many different species. So it's important that we try to address this issue before we lose too much more. So the causes. So this is my tricky slide, bear with me, because there's a couple of explanations for what's going on, and they can be quite detailed, but I'll just whiz over them. So in 2008 and again in 2014, we had 2 summers that were extremely hot. Summer heat shock that are comprised of up to a week of temperatures above 40 degrees, 45 degrees. So we know, and immediately after these short, sharp bouts of heat, we know the canopies withered and dropped their leaves. And as I say, over a period of months, if not years, we get a little bit of coppicing happening for some of those trees. So what the physiologists tell us that's been happening is you get this enormous water differential, vapor differential between the canopy of the tree and the root system. As the temperatures continue day after day, of course, the root system can't recharge the water from deep down, and so you get an impossibly large, what they call hydraulic pressure difference between the canopy and the root system. And the tubes that supply the water up through the tree, called the xylem, begin to pop, collapse, or embolize. And actually physiologists tell us you can actually hear that happening occasions, popping in the trees. And once those xylems collapse, those xylem tubes collapse, of course, the main vesicle for water supporting the canopy goes, and the canopy, we get this severe leaf scorch and loss. And then following that, in autumn, because there is no canopy to generate carbohydrates, of course the canopy is harvesting energy, the tree literally starves of lack of soluble carbohydrates. Now we add to that, we've actually, in this project, we've done some modelling of the 2 species, and we understand that from the modelling, we understand one of the key climate attributes that most influence the distribution of these trees is autumn rainfall. If you miss out on autumn rainfall, which is what happened in those 2 years, then what few carbohydrates are in the tree aren't mobilised because there's no soil water. So it's quite a difficult and depressing scenario. So on to a more positive note. Our revegetation strategy consists of our main goal is to broaden the gene pool of the 2 species up there by using provenances, trees from the same species from different regions of Australia that are adapted to these hot, dry climates. Once we've introduced those, we'll just let nature sort it out. The trees will breed eventually, they'll drop seeds, will regrowth or new recruits, and climate will sort out the trees that are adapted and the ones that aren't. And we're just driving that by introducing a broader gene pool. So the second point is we've used what is called climate analogues to select those provenances, and I'll talk to you about that in a moment. And then we've set this enormous experiment up, and this picture here is just jumping ahead a few slides, but this is where we're actually doing the preparation for planting all these labelled trees. So the Climate Analogues tool is a really natty tool that CSIRO and the Bureau of Meteorology have developed and put online that anyone can use. You essentially set up some climate scenarios that you think are probable over, in our case, 50 to 70 years. So we've set up 3 different scenarios: a really extreme one, a moderate one, and a less extreme scenario, and of course the current scenario. And we selected provenances up here which match those scenarios. But how have we done that? We've used the Climate Analogues tool, which essentially takes the climate of Nadu and projects 50 to 70 years ahead based on these scenarios, and tells us which areas in our case New South Wales or South Australia that are already experiencing the climate that we project we will have through these scenarios in 50 to 70 years time. And then we overlay that with a knowledge of where grey box and yellow box are going, and then we can come up with these different regions, provenances, where we can go and select seed for our trial. So we set this up as a trial. The purpose is to evaluate this provenancing strategy. The aim, as I've said before, is to track the genetic diversity that we've been able to introduce and the extent of adaptation in grey box. And of course, this is, unfortunately, that result will outlive me, but it'll be there for decades to come to check. The trial will inform future reserve management decisions and community management decisions on trees and provenances that we can plant in the region. And finally, the trial encourages future collaboration. This is such an important thing because we're setting out on a formal experiment. This will attract and has attracted universities and CSIRO interest so that they can come work, do their experiments through students and projects, and further the knowledge that we're gaining on behalf of bush heritage in the community. Then comes the trial design, which took us a long time to develop. It's actually quite a complex trial design. I won't bore you with the details, but it's designed to be very informative in the short term, medium term, and the long term. So there's 2 eucalypt species that I've mentioned. We've selected 5 provenances per species, and within each provenance, we've selected 10 separate mother trees, which we're calling families. So just to check how much genetic variation is within a provenance, and then 11,000 plants planted over about 18 hectares. And this design was set up, we started last year, we planted last year. This is just a picture of a schematic of one of our 18 blocks, 18 experimental blocks across the landscape, many different aspects. And the coloured plots there's 25 plots in a block, and each plot is a different provenance. And you'll see there the orange lines are the rip lines where the trees are planted within the blocks, and there's 25 trees in each plot. And that's probably all the detail you need to give you a sense that it's a big experiment. It was a vast experiment, but as long as things go reasonably well, it'll be there for many decades to answer questions. And I'm really pleased to say, even after 9 months, we have just finished doing our first real assessment of the trial, and all the results aren't in, so these are only partial results. But the one thing that I wanted to leave you with here is that these results simply show us that we've been successful in introducing genetic diversity into the grey box and yellow box. How do I know that? Well, we had a shocking beginning to this season last year. We planted the winter in spring, no rainfall whatsoever. It was one of the driest springs and we lost a lot of trees. So you'll see perhaps on the scale here, percentage survival. These are just grey box, by the way. And already after less than 12 months, we're down to 30 to 40% for grey box and sadly even less for yellow box because so many were lost over this very difficult spring and early summer. But one interesting result, Wedderburn is the control, by the way, the local provenance. One interesting result is that the provenances from Mathara are doing significantly better. We haven't done all the results yet. They're not all in, but over many blocks, Mathara is 12% more surviving plants than the control Wedderburn. This is Mathara here, the provenance from just over the Murray River. We haven't been able to assess the mother trees and the families yet. And plant height, here's another piece of evidence that indeed the genetic diversity that we were so keen to introduce is there. We're seeing the five-field provenance, this last one here, is significantly higher than Wedderburn. Now these are just seedlings, and I absolutely get that seedling height is probably not a function of long-term robustness, but it might be. But it does certainly indicate that there is some terrific genetic variability being introduced there. And this is just after 9 months, so we're very pleased with that. And I should say we've still got another year of planting. We're putting 2 more provenances in this season, so hopefully we won't have such a devastating start to their planted life. Now, just to conclude, our goals. As I keep stressing, to maintain the integrity of the existing ecosystem at Nadu and its function by ensuring that the eucalypts up there continue to have a long-term future. And to do that, to create a broader, more resilient genetic mix for those species that will cope with the hot, dry times. And I have already mentioned that this is in support of the UN Sustainable Development Goals to take action, urgent action against climate change and to protect our terrestrial ecosystems, so terribly important. And finally, but not at all least, this project is only possible through just terrific collaboration and working with all aspects of society. So Bush Heritage and Greenfleet have worked together. Greenfleet, terrific organisation to work with. They've financed much of the nursery work and planting of the trees. The Arborline Nursery in Hamilton, this nursery has been terrific. They see their future is understanding how climate's going to impact on native trees, and they have to prepare for the future as well. So they're quite invested in supporting us. University of Melbourne, CSIRO, and the University of Tasmania. The scientists there have been terrific to work with. They've supported us, they've advised us on experimental design and provenance selection and strategy and so on. It's been terrific to work with those people. And we've had terrific support by so many volunteers through the different phases of this project. The Hamilton Field naturalists and students from Bendigo, TAFE and La Trobe University are certainly a large part of them, but by no means all of them. And Vic Rhodes gave us a little bit of seed funding at the very beginning to find those provenances. That's it. I've gone over my time. I'm sorry about that, Heather. Just one last point. If you're interested in reading more about this trial, we do have a website dedicated to it at the Bush Heritage site. If you just Google Nadu Climate Ready down here, you'll get many more details.
Great. Thank you so much, Garry. And thank you to everybody who's sending through questions. We will get to Q&A, and I think one of the questions we've probably already answered, which is about the survival rate. So thank you very much for that question. So we will get to questions in a minute, but this is, and we'll be able to share, do the Q&A with myself, Garry, and with Linda. So now this is just an opportunity to hear a little bit from Linda. So Linda, you will need to demute your microphone because you're on mute at the moment. And Linda actually helps us out volunteering and has been a great supporter, and this is just an opportunity, well, not just, this is an opportunity for Linda to just share part of her story with you, and then we'll open up to Q&A. So Linda, across to you.
Great. Thank you, Heather. I hope you can hear me okay. So I have the dream volunteer job because I work on the photo library at Bush Heritage, which means I get to see wonderful pictures of all the reserves. And I suppose I had 4 reasons I wanted to discuss as to why I've been a long-term supporter of Bush Heritage. So one of them is transparency. I am so impressed by the transparency of the organisation, the ability to say it as it is. If any of you have read the publication, now it's from 2016, so a little bit old, on the history of Bush Heritage. It's a very good expose of what's done, what worked, what didn't, in a very transparent way. The second thing I really admire about Bush Heritage, the more I found out about it, is the dedication to science. Having been an environmental educator myself, it's wonderful to see the scientific basis on which decisions are made and the ecological knowledge of the staff who are involved both on the ground and in the office with things that are done. My first visit to Nadu was with the Indigenous Flora and Fauna Association, and Haroon, the manager there, showed us around the property, and several of the botanists on our committee, Brian Bainbridge and Carl Just, had these amazing conversations with Haroon about the botany there. So that was really very impressive. The other thing I guess I found out more about being in the office is the dedication of the staff there. So many of the staff actually go and volunteer on some of the projects on the reserves, so spend their spare time going, and I think several of them were involved in the planting at Nadu Hills. So it's great to hear those on-ground stories from people. One of the things that other people have told me about, because I haven't been to reserves outside of Victoria, is the strength of the Aboriginal partnerships that Bush Heritage has, and several of my environmental friends who've been involved in these have remarked on how well those Aboriginal partnerships have been managed. So the reputation of Bush Heritage certainly is very strong within the environmental community. Now, I'd like to add one extra goal that I think Bush Heritage achieves with all of this, and maybe it's in some ways a personal thing for me, which is that it's the goal 3 in the Sustainable Development Goals, which is good health, because I think that knowing that these areas of land are being protected, the flora and fauna, really contributes to certainly my mental health, and I suspect to the mental health of a lot of people who support Bush Heritage. So it really is very heartening to hear those stories and see the photos of staff managing through floods and fires and really quite adverse situations to manage those reserves well. So I might leave it there, Heather. Hope that's okay.
No, thank you, Linda, and that's fantastic. And this is about us all just now having a bit of a conversation and just sharing our insights. So thank you, Linda and Garry. We do have a series of questions, so I will go through these and sort of farm them to whoever is appropriate to answer it. So, so both Linda and Garry, you might need to have your microphones unmuted so that you can swing into action. The first question is probably one that I'll pick up, and it's from a supporter who's been reading Fire Country by Victor Stephenson. I'm sure a number of you on this call will have been reading that book. And it talks really about the insights from Indigenous fire practices, and the person is asking, have we actually been involved with any of that? So we are heavily involved in understanding and learning, and also supporting Indigenous fire practices and cultural burning. So we have a national fire manager who's Richard Geddes, and he has a lot of experience, particularly in the Kimberley. So we're actually involved at the moment. I actually have teams out at the moment in the Kimberley helping with the cultural burning that's occurring with Bunaba and Woonabulgumbura. And through that, we're learning far more about how we then, on managing the properties that we have the responsibility for managing, how we should be utilising some of those practices, and how to let the land tell us where to burn and how to burn. We also have been involved, particularly in the Karakara Wedderburn, with Jar Jar Warung, who have done a one cultural burn on one of the reserves, and we were planning for this year, but COVID-19 has got in the way, and that has restricted a number of the activities that we'd like to do. But certainly we're learning heaps, and looking at how we can integrate those practices on the reserves, but with the traditional owners that of the reserves. So we're not doing this in isolation. We're not taking their knowledge. This is how we do things in partnership, how we do it with deep, deep respect for traditional owners and their knowledge of the land, and how we work together and how we take that time to learn together. So certainly we are involved with understanding that and trying to implement practices. Next question. I think we've answered the one about the survival rates, which is great. Question, Gary, what are the implications of the trial? Will there be more extensive planting elsewhere? I don't know whether you and the rest of the ecology team have had some discussions about, well, after Nadu, where to next? So do you want to have a shot at that one?
There's certainly no formal plans. In fact, we need a big holiday after this one. So we're not in a hurry to plan another one. But there are, in fact, neighbouring properties. Owners have rung us about what would we recommend that they plant, and of course it's incredibly difficult because it's very early on. I have to say we haven't really talked about what comes next, but that will be a conversation once we get our final planting in this year, where we'll sort of get around the table and sort through the next steps. Sorry, wasn't a very good answer.
No, it's great, Gary. And what I should share more broadly is actually our ecologists are all together virtually this week. They were going to be all face-to-face in Hamlin near the World Heritage Shark Bay area. Needless to say, that couldn't happen. So they're all meeting up virtually to discuss things like these challenges, the challenges of the fires, how can we get actually more of the assessment work done, utilising the data, having those active debates about provenance. Because I can remember back 15 years ago, it was almost sacrilege to say that you would use, provenance from a different area. That was a definite no-no. Whereas now there's far more active discussion about, well, actually, if we want these habitats to survive, we're going to have to be more interventionist than we ever were in the past. So that past philosophy of, get a parcel of land, lock it up and just let it go do its own thing. I don't think we can do that anymore. So there's a lot of active debate about how we need to be actively there managing weeds and ferals, but also doing these sort of experiments and trying things out and recognising that some of them will fail. But that's okay, because we'll learn through those failures. And that's why the Nadu Hills program is really important. Of course, there are other organisations within the conservation space that we work with, such as the Greening Australia, who have got a national seed program and work that they do in this area, the Land Cares of the world, all of those sort of organisations, and we're all looking at this. So even though NADU is just one project, and as Garry said, you'll probably need a decent holiday after putting in all those seedlings. But it's how we connect them with everybody else to continue to learn from these sorts of experiments. Question, and I'm not sure on this, but do we know whether we've had much rain this year up at NADU, so that we can try and consolidate a bit of that seedling growth before we get another big hot patch? Have you got any, Garry, where we're at with rainfall up there?
Sorry, Heather, you broke up there a bit. Could you repeat that question?
Sorry, what level of rainfall have we had at NADU? Has it been okay for helping the growth of the seedlings?
Yes, thank you. Yeah. So the rainfall story, as I said, last spring, immediately after we planted them last spring, was devastating. Early summer was obviously devastating everywhere. And then come February, March, we began to get a bit of rain, and now we've had fantastic conditions. The soil moisture is quite deep, and the projections are we'll continue to get some reasonable rainfall. So we're hoping that this year will be a very successful year, both for the trees that have survived to date and for those new seedlings that are going in to complement the existing trial. Did that come across?
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Garry. There's a question about whether there's a potential business opportunity in this sort of area. Look, there potentially is, but part of this is also how we all collectively learn together. So it's about how we, in conjunction with all of our partners and with all of the sector and all of the population, can actually help our planet through the challenges that we've presented with climate. Of course, COVID-19 has had some upsides. One of the very few is the fact that the decreased level of travel that we're all doing is helping the planet just breathe a little bit. And if we can try and entrench some of those changes and behaviours, then hopefully we can also start, as a global community, reversing some of the challenges.
Heather,
yeah.
Can I just... So was that question about whether there's a business opportunity flowing from what we're learning in this trial? Was that the nature?
Not sure. It's just a question of whether there's a business opportunity.
Can I just say there is an issue that concerns me about, and I think there is a business opportunity in the medium term. The problem is that for all those landholders across Australia that are interested in provenancing, looking at alternative provenances, where do they go to get alternative provenances? And of course the nurseries don't have them. Most of the nurseries don't even know where their stock comes from. They don't know the provenances. So I do think through working with government and not-for-profits, the seed industry particularly could come together and we could make a real opportunity out of this over the next few years, but it's very, very early days.
Great, thanks for that, Garry. And there's certainly been some money as part of the bushfire recovery work being put into the seed side of things, because there's a huge recognition that we're low on seeds. Now, we have reached our time, but I'm going to answer, I think, the last question that we haven't responded to, which was in relationships to counts on fauna and bird populations in relationship to bushfire impacted areas. Certainly all of the properties that we have had the fires on, we have got camera traps out, we are doing the ecological assessments, and a key thing there is understanding how quickly birds and different species come back into the area. Also, we had a number of reserves like Brogo and Tarcutta which weren't burnt, but everything around them was. So it's really important that we do that assessment work there. So we are doing those surveys at the moment. So watch this space as we share some of those results. We have got to the end of our time, and sorry, Linda, there wasn't a question for you, but we really appreciated you sharing your insights, and we will try and get you out to reserves that are a little bit further afield, because Nadu Hills is fantastic and close by, and once the travel restrictions lift, then there's the amazing desert countries in Queensland, or the huge night skies that you get in places like Nari or Hamlin, or being at the bottom of Western Australia the Fitzsterlings and being able to see the little honey possums, which is over the shoulder of Garry. For those that can see, it's this tiny little possum that sits in your palm of your hand and lives off nectar. So there is an amazing amount of variety. Thank you so much to everybody for dialing in and being part of this conversation. We really appreciate it. Thank you to Garry and to Linda. Without volunteers such as yourself, we just can't do it. There are just not enough people, not enough hours in the day to do all the things that we want to do. So thank you so much for your support and for being part of this conversation. For everybody online, have a fantastic rest of the day. Please stay safe. We are living in weird and wacky times, and look forward to continuing to engage with you. And if you have any questions post this session that you think of, please drop us an email and we'd love to respond to them. But thank you so much and have a great day. Thanks everybody. Yep. Bye.